atheists, agnostics, long-haired weirdos, short-haired weirdos, vandals, hooligans.
The government, hug the government, love the government, hug the government, love the government, hug the government.
Welcome to The Politics Guys, a place for bipartisan, rational, and civil debate on American politics and policy. I'm Northern Kentucky University political scientist Michael Baranowski. My guest today is Nicholas Dirks, Chancellor of UC Berkeley from 2013 through 2017. Professor Dirks has had a long and distinguished career in academia and academic administration and is the author of multiple books, the latest of which is City of Intellect, The Uses and Abuses of the University, which we'll be discussing today. Professor Dirks, welcome to the show.
Great to be here, Michael.
So you have been at the upper levels of academic administration for a long time, but you started out as historical anthropologist. And I was wondering how you feel that academic background has sort of influenced how you see, how you understand the challenges that are facing higher education today.
First, that's a great question to begin with, since indeed I did not anticipate nor actually work towards becoming an academic administrator when I entered the academy many, many years ago. I studied India, South Asia, and I began studying history rather than anthropology. But when I went to graduate school, the person who was teaching the history of India was an anthropologist by training. So I got kind of sucked into a joint disciplinary program that itself was part of even a larger interdisciplinary group under the kind of general rubric of area studies. And area studies brought together people from literary and cultural studies disciplines, along with social scientists, and really tried to take a holistic view of a part of the world. So I was very interdisciplinary, and that was certainly part of being a historical anthropologist, to go into academic administration when I did it, with the idea that, bringing together people who work in different kinds of departments, programs, siloed centers, and the like would be a good thing, and something that I had both commitment to and some experience of. And the other thing, of course, was that it, by virtue of the fact that I had spent so much time in and been part of setting up programs related to the study of South Asia, I was very committed to a kind of global footprint for universities, and so worked towards that in all the different kinds of administrative roles I played. So, both the interdisciplinary side and the global side. But the last part of it, I guess, is that when you think about the two disciplines of history and anthropology, both of them deal with difference across time and across space. And so I began with a sense that institutions do, in fact, change over time, and they also change by virtue of different kinds of cultural and social conditions. So I was not averse to the idea that universities might have to continue to change and not just hold on to the things that doubtless made them great in the past, but perhaps didn't position them very well for the future.
Certainly, we have seen a lot of change in each of our respective careers, yours being longer than mine. And, it seems like there are just a torrent of books in the last few years about higher ed, the problems with higher ed, how to maybe address some of these problems. And so you've written a book about higher ed, though it's a different sort of book. I'm just kind of curious about how you see, or what you hope for City of Intellect to sort of contribute to this body of work.
So, as you say, City of Intellect is a little different than the kind of standard issue, higher education is in flames, what to do to solve it. And I specifically didn't want to have one of those subtitles where I would promise that I would come up with all the solutions for, whatever it is, although I was invited to do that by different publishers. But my book is intended to really do a couple of things. One is to draw people in, to draw readers in to some of the experiences I had as a student, as a professor, as chair of a department, as a dean of the faculty, and ultimately as a chancellor, by telling stories of my different kinds of experiences and the kinds of things that I was engaged in, both things that I feel very proud about and things that were deeply frustrating. And I try to be as honest as I can be about the ups and downs, and there were both. and they were sometimes quite intense. So that's one thing. And the idea here is not so much to write a personal memoir, but to use personal stories to draw readers into the kind of complexity of the issues and the contradictions that really are part of, any effort to diagnose and then recommend solutions for some of the challenges in higher education. But the second thing is that I did want to draw from that, use that personal experience as a kind of spine for thinking both historically and in terms of the future about what we might be able to do to shift the framework, to shift the kind of conversation that we're having about everything from the value of the humanities and undergraduate education to the importance of thinking about these questions around cost and accessibility in a serious way that doesn't give up on the idea that, you want to have the best possible kind of experience and the best possible education at the same time that you don't want it to be reserved solely for people who are very, very wealthy or attend, just the few very, very wealthy colleges and universities that I'm sure we'll go on to talk about.
One of the really valuable things I feel, because I've read a bunch of these books or sometimes just paged through them when I couldn't bear reading the whole thing. But what I feel makes your book both different and valuable is that first part of the book where you take the reader through your career. Because for me, it really brings home an understanding that a university is more than one thing. And I feel like so often in our discussions about higher education, people tend to approach institutions of higher education as one thing. And as you go throughout your career, it's clear how your perspective shifts when you have to go from the perspective of a student to a faculty member to administration to upper administration. And I feel like one of the real problems we struggle with when we talk about higher ed is that it's not just one thing. And unless someone can have that sort of multi-area understanding of it, it's really sort of hard to talk about solutions when we don't even know what a university is in its entirety.
Well, I can't claim that I talk about all the differences and the entire picture of higher education, but I have had, different kinds of not only positions in universities, but I've worked at both public and private universities and universities that focused, like Caltech, where I had my first teaching job on science and engineering, and universities that have been known for a core curriculum in relationship to an undergraduate education like Columbia. But my sense is that we really do have to do two things. One, understand that university administrators, who often are vilified because they're seen as either, the ones who are answering the questions in a completely inadequate way when called up to congressional inquiries, as we saw last December, or they're the ones who are, sort of pursuing corporatist interests or just accumulating money in the endowment and then making cuts when they claim there are budget crises and the like. I moved into academic administration because I was trying to, get some things done and do some things that I was interested in. And I had the opportunities to do that. And in the beginning, I didn't see myself as kind of, taking off my white hat, putting on a black hat, or going into the dark side in the kind of way that academics joke about academic administration. But I did have to begin to change the way I looked at things. And when I moved to different offices, I saw the university from different perspectives, and I did want to share that in the book. But I also, and this is the second thing I'll say in relationship to this, I also saw the tyranny of the rankings and the ways in which things like the U.S. News and World Report rankings of colleges and universities impose a kind of standard set of metrics on all institutions of higher education in a way that has become pretty pervasive and has meant that many colleges and universities actually try to just up their rankings, up their position on the rankings charts by following the same metrics and trying to check the boxes that everybody else is trying to check. So I also here am writing about the need to embrace difference and to accept the fact that different kinds of institutions should serve different kinds of populations, teach different kinds of subjects, think about how they're organized in different kinds of ways, and begin to think about the larger ecosystem of higher education in a different way, so that community colleges are seen as every bit as valuable as the flagship public universities, and in turn, the great public universities that serve more regional or local populations every bit as important and in some respects excellent as the Ivy League, where of course all the attention seems to focus.
There was one, I don't recall where it was in the book, but it really struck me when you were writing about, I think, your experiences in administration. And you wrote something to the effect of, oftentimes what people pushing for change don't fully appreciate is sort of how constrained people in positions of so-called power are, and how difficult it can be with all the cross pressures. And it struck me that that's not just a lesson for university administration, but in general for people in these positions of so-called power, that oftentimes you really are much more constrained than people telling you, well, just do this and it'll all be better, actually really understand.
Yeah, thanks for alluding to that part of the book, because, on the one hand, I don't want to say, nor was it true that, I had no power whatsoever in these positions. I certainly had a range of decisions that I could make, and the authority to make decisions that did have real consequence for people who, doubtless felt that I had unlimited power in the positions I had. But I did want to call attention to, the limits of power, the fact that when you're in these positions, you really do begin to take much more seriously a broader sense of who are who make up the constituencies of the university, what the different kinds of interests that make it up are, what the range of goals are, and the extent to which there are very different ways of approaching and thinking about the university if you move out of a particular department, and the faculty meetings that take place there, and the kind of often very uniform sense of what a university should be. And I have to say this, having been, in departments and even a department chair for a while, when you're sitting in a department, you think, what has the university done for me recently? Am I getting the kind of allocations for new faculty positions or for graduate students or resources to, teach a better major or whatever? In a broader kind of context in which you really aren't thinking about the needs of the chemists or the business school or other kinds of entities across the university. So, it's partly, that sense of the complexity and scale of the university that I wanted to remind people wherever they are situated in the university, changes the way in which you have to think as an administrator. And of course, there are other kinds of constraints. In a public university, there are even more constraints because you're being looked at by the governor, you're being looked at by the state legislature. But even in private universities, and we've seen this recently, you get evaluated constantly by alumni, by donors, by boards of trustees, and there are limits to what you can do. It's in a way, and you generalize this to think about different kinds of fields. I remember, many of my friends were deeply frustrated during the presidency of Barack Obama by, thinking on the one hand that they shared so much with him, but then he didn't go, completely all out to pursue the kind of progressive agenda that they thought he shared with them, and that they believed that, had he simply decided to follow, would have, changed the nature of American politics. But I was always so struck by the extent to which, he had to focus. He had to say, well, I'm going to work on healthcare. And if I work on healthcare, that's going to mean that other things I'm going to do are going to be much more difficult. And I have to, work very hard to accommodate different kinds of interests and to be responsible to the full electorate. Now, we've seen our politics, change a bit in the years since then. And I think, there could be, perhaps on the part of some of these people I'm referring to, more appreciation now in retrospect. But even in the most powerful position in the country and indeed in the world, I think there are constraints. And I tried to suggest some of them and give some textures to that in my account of what it was like to be a chancellor at UC Berkeley.
And I think almost everyone, while there are plenty of people who disagree about higher education, one thing almost everyone can agree on is that things are tough. I mean, if we look at just something as basic as public confidence, 2015, a Gallup poll finds 57% of Americans with confidence in higher ed. In 2023, it was down to around 36%. And that's before the plagiarism scandal and the thing with Harvard's former president, Claudine Gay, and the anti-Semitism allegations and all that. So I'm sure if we did it today, it'd be even worse. Why do you think so many Americans now just seem to have so little faith in higher education?
I think there are several reasons for this, and some of them have to do with the very specific political history that we've been living through over the last decade in particular. And I would date it in particular, I think, to the economic crisis of 2008, 2009, which led to both a kind of major shock to the system, but also to growing inequality, an increasing sense on the part of many that the system is rigged, the clear observation that there's a kind of growing chasm between the haves and the have-nots, between the very elite and everybody else. And they see this reflected in the world of higher education, where you have, massive endowments at places like Harvard, Yale, and Stanford. And then you have, local community colleges and state colleges struggling for resources and yet, not getting any of the kind of either prestige or recognition for the work they do in their local communities to actually try to provide accessible and affordable higher education. But you could even take the story back further, because in a way, and indeed the Berkeley story I tell has some examples of this, I think, that are pretty important. You could go all the way back to the 1960s, because, of course, there was a lot of skepticism about American universities in the 60s. And that skepticism, that sense of, the universities are out of touch, they're not reflecting the core values of America and the like, actually goes back to, in some fundamental sense, the free speech movement that took place at UC Berkeley in 1964. And an up-and-coming politician who decided to run for governor in 1966, Ronald Reagan, actually made Berkeley into the primary issue of his campaign. He said that if he elected, he was going to clean up the mess at Berkeley. And he talked a great deal about what he saw as the decline of American universities, the decline of morals that was reflected in those universities, the kind of inattention of the faculty to real issues in the world, et cetera, and of course the claim that most faculty were Marxists and communists and working against the interests of the average American and indoctrinating the youth and so on and so forth. But he did get elected. First thing he did was to fire the president of the University of California, Clark Kerr, who had been the first chancellor of UC Berkeley back in the 50s. And, and then, of course, the protests and clamor on the university campuses around Vietnam, Cambodia, civil rights, et cetera. It just kind of kept universities in the news for a long time. It was pretty chaotic back then. So, that was the beginning point. I think things did calm down, but I also know that in the 1980s and 90s, there was a concerted effort on the part of certain very conservative interests, exemplified in the work that was being done in think tanks like the Goldwater Institute, for example, that began to really try to make a move to bring conservatism back into the mainstream fold of the university, to attack what they saw as the left-wing extravagance of many university faculty and administrators. And there were efforts really over decades that were made to go after the university. But in the same process of trying to change the politics of college campuses, the curriculum, there were debates over, the college curriculum that came out in particular when Alan Bloom wrote The Closing of the American Mind in the late 1980s, and it became a best-selling book in the New York Times. This idea that, if we only went back to teaching the classics of, the great stories and epics and literature of the Greeks and the Romans, we could have a college campus that was training, future leaders in a way that we would respect and perhaps admire, as opposed to what we were getting. But, that's continued, and that just got amped up after 2008, 2009. And we've seen, some of that in recent years. And I saw some of it at Berkeley during my chancellorship, when there were organizations that were, some of which associated, say, with Breitbart News, that were funding controversial speakers to go around and speak on campuses like Berkeley's, precisely to cause foment and to try to create chaos around these issues that, of course, began to be talked about having to do with free speech, the actual openness of college and university campuses to right-wing views, or even just, conservative views. So I see this as a kind of continuous story that then, completely, in some sense, gets exacerbated by the pandemic and all the kind of roiling that's taken place around science, around elite institutions, around, anything that in some sense is seen as part of the deep state, or, the associated institutions that are claimed to be part of that. And of course, a lot of that is because of the kind of rhetoric that people like Donald Trump have made now part of the mainstream of our American political discourse.
You mentioned this idea that universities are full of, communist, Marxist, left-wing indoctrination. And certainly that is the common view, particularly for the social sciences and humanities. And in the book, you talk about at one point this small but vocal group who bemoan the idea that diversity doesn't mean an equal number of right-wing professors as those on the left, assuming bizarrely that the mainstream political spectrum in the U.S. should be the measure of the university's intellectual diversity. And so I could hear a conservative reading that and saying, well, hold on a second. Why is it bizarre for me to expect that the intellectual diversity of our top universities, shouldn't that actually reflect what we see in the general public? And I could see that same conservative saying, and in fact, isn't that what most universities are trying to do when it comes to ethnic and racial diversity? And isn't intellectual diversity really more important to a university than some sort of demographic diversity? And I'm sure you have some thoughts on this, and I'd love to hear them.
Yeah, thanks for the question. It's a good question, and it demands, to be taken seriously. So I did write those words, and let me try to explain what I had in mind. First, I think my sense that you don't want to hire a faculty around a distribution of views that is part of the general American electorate, because, of course, you're hiring a professional group of people who have been certified, whether in physics and chemistry or in political science and literature, to be specialists in a particular field. And, I hate to say this, but they're just, there's an uneven distribution of this kind of this kind of lifestyle choice and this kind of interest, which doesn't map nicely onto American political categories. I can't, for example, imagine that there are very many adherents, say, of the MAGA side of the Republican Party today who would be in almost any of the disciplines that exist, not just the humanities and humanistic social sciences. So, what I meant to suggest is that, I think that's the wrong measure for the diversity of the faculty around intellectual issues. Now, it is true that in terms of both faculty and student body, people like me, university administrators, have certainly tried to diversify both cohorts and bring in more and more people who come from underserved backgrounds, whether in relationship to being a member of an underrepresented minority or coming from a lower socioeconomic position, et cetera, et cetera. But even there, I think the sense is that, if you look at the numbers, universities like Berkeley still haven't, by any stretch of the imagination, begun to mirror society at large. It was about, breaking down the extent to which, back when I started, the faculty was mostly not just white, but male. So, we've made a lot of efforts to diversify that because it's been seen as important. But that doesn't mean necessarily that people you're hiring who will come from different kinds of backgrounds and positions and have different perspectives are going to, have one perspective per identity position. And actually, I think one of the things we've been striving to do in the university world is increasingly break down that connection between who you are and what you think. And I think that's an important issue. I'm much more concerned, though, with what it would mean to really open up the criteria that we use to recruit faculty instead of just trying to recruit both faculty and students, for that matter, who think like we do as senior members of the faculty. So I actually do believe that we have to be much more open and much more adventurous, excuse me, in the way in which we think about hiring, think about recruiting, think about bringing people into the university. And that does entail a certain measure of viewpoint diversity. I think we need to have people who think about literature differently. We need to have people who think about different kinds of philosophical positions differently. And I think that, sometimes the notion that all hiring decisions, all curricular decisions are going to be made within single departments fails to capture the broader perspectives that would come if you really did bring together faculty from different parts of the university and say, what do you think would add something to the mix of faculty you have in this particular part of the university? So I'm definitely in favor of more diversity, and I do believe that there's been a tendency to hyper-professionalize the academy in a way that has imposed a certain level of uniformity that is unhelpful when you actually begin to think about the openness of the university to internal debate. But that debate still has to follow certain kinds of rules and protocols that require a deep commitment to scholarship, to scientific research, to the scientific method, and to things that people basically have to sign on to, and which doesn't necessarily mean that you have people from every part of the political spectrum.
Well, it seems to me that what's also maybe even more important is a commitment to sort of the open-minded and free exchange of ideas. And I think how in recent years we've seen a trend toward more and more schools requiring applicants for jobs to put together what are called DIE diversity statements, how they would contribute to the diversity, that their experiences in that. And it seems to me that in looking at that, one might actually emphasize contributions and a commitment to viewpoint diversity along with that, if that's a direction that universities want to go. And maybe there could be more of that, and that would be a good thing for the university in general.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think that we need to broaden the way we think about diversity and certainly be more capacious in the way in which we, ask potential candidates, whether to be students or to be hired as faculty, to think about their contributions, which is to say to bring, a different kind of voice, a different kind of view, a different kind of perspective to the subject at hand. And one of the things I did when I was at Columbia, when I was much more involved because I was a dean, not a chancellor, in faculty hiring, was to hire a number of people who were primarily novelists, but to come to teach English literature. And, at the first mention of some of these names, people in the department would say, well, they don't have
Right.
a PhD in literature. Are you sure that, they're not just going to come in and trash what critics do? There's a big difference between the critic and the writer. And well, then I suggested we recruit, for example, Colm Tóibín, an Irish novelist who happens to have written extraordinary novels about major literary figures, including Henry James and Thomas Mann, but also written a great deal about Irish literary culture in essays and even a couple of books that go beyond his fictional output. And, as soon as he came into the picture, people talked to him and said, oh, yes, this would be a good idea. And, I thought that was great. And he's still teaching one semester every year at Columbia. He spends the rest of his year in Dublin. But he adds enormous, strengths to great English department, but with a very different sensibility about the nature of literary right, of literature, being a producer as well as a critic of literature.
When I think about some of the major issues that are embroiling many campuses now, I think about speech issues and uninviting speakers or shouting down speakers, things like that. And you address this in multiple places in the book. And at one point, you talk about the belief of some people, usually on the left, that free speech can only really be exercised by people in power. And so universities saying, well, we're committed to open debate, that invariably ends up sort of privileging dominant views because the playing field is uneven to start with. And do you think, I feel like I have a certain amount of sympathy for that, but it's a real thorny issue. And I wanted to get your take on that view that you refer to, and how universities can sort of cope with that or grapple with that.
It's a real problem, and it's good of you to identify it, because I think it does raise some really critical but quite thorny problems and questions. Now, on the one hand, I certainly accept that, and we talked about this before, that positions of power do change the way in which people can be allowed to and able to exercise their speech rights. Some people have louder microphones than others, and certainly there's not just greater access to a microphone, but a greater confidence when a microphone is given to you, I suppose, in terms of these kinds of power differentials. On the other hand, the whole premise of the university is that people come together and share a commitment to knowledge, to truth, to exploration, to discovery, that requires that they argue about, these kinds of issues, whether it's the interpretation of an historical event or the nature of change over time in the history of physics or in biology laboratory, as to whether or not it would be advisable to continue the kinds of experiments with gene editing that might lead to designer babies at some point, if also produce a cure for something like Huntington's. And you want to be able to be assured that, that people, whoever they are, whether they're, at the lab bench, in the back row of the classroom, or, sitting in the administration hall, have the capacity to be heard, and to be heard in a way that is respectful, that is engaged, and that allows different kinds of views, perspectives, and opinions to really get heard. So look, it's never going to be a level playing field. It's not a perfect world. We know how skewed things can be, but the university has to acknowledge that. It even has a lot of people studying that on the one side, while at the same time, exercising the kind of open forum that, it was hard earned. I mean, even going back to the free speech movement at Berkeley in 1964, to really be able to say this is what is fundamental to a university. Now, there are political opinions that people hold within universities, and they should be able to express those views outside of classrooms and so on and so forth. And in public universities, we're in fact mandated by our adherence to the First Amendment to allow people to speak regardless of what their view is. And of course, there, the question is always, at what point does free speech become hate speech? And is hate speech really protected by the First Amendment? And of course, a lot of hate speech is, not all of it. But by the same token, if you start saying, well, I'm going to listen to, somebody who folks think of as being far left because I agree with those views, but I'm going to shout down anybody who comes from the far right and not let them speak, well, you're actually violating the terms of the First Amendment. And if you translate that then into the scholarly domain, and you begin to say, there are only certain kinds of views that we can accept as serious, you have to be able to back that up not by a political judgment, but by using the nature of academic reason and and the high standards of academic debate to make your case and sustain it. So I did myself get shouted down from various stages at different times. I certainly was presiding over Berkeley when Milo Yiannopoulos came to town and was shut down by a group of Antifa who marched into the campus and basically started attacking the student union where he was going to speak. And I've seen, the kind of worst side of this effort to control speech by shutting down speech you don't like. And to me, it is anathema and totally opposed to the spirit of the university. Does that mean that, sitting around the university and, at a seminar table where, there are people from different kinds of backgrounds with different levels of authority, that it's going to, feel like a completely open and democratic world? When there's some people who know a lot more than others and some people who have done, much more work in their fields than newcomers. No, it's not going to be perfect. But you have to follow certain kinds of ideals. Otherwise, you're going to not just fall short of ideals. We all do that, but you're going to actually sacrifice the fundamental value of the university for our society at large.
Earlier, you referred in a way to sort of the haves versus the have-nots of higher education, and that being perhaps part of the reason why people have lost faith. And there's this old saying, you've heard it, that if you look at its balance sheet, it seems like Harvard's basically a hedge fund that offers some courses. You take a look at Harvard's endowment, somewhere over $51 billion. And even over time, if we just look at the endowments of, say, the top 50 schools, over the last 20 years, they've grown from like 143 to 563 billion. And so I think people are looking at this sort of thing at the top universities and saying, what are they doing with all this money? I mean, and obviously you can't answer for all of them, but you have a sense of that landscape. And so how do you respond to people who say, well, they're just hoarding all this money essentially and not doing the good that they could do with it?
Well, the first thing to say about these endowments is that they are almost all of them restricted. So, the endowment is made up of thousands and thousands of individual gifts, each of which has a gift agreement and effectively a contract dictating how the money that is earned out of the endowment is going to be spent or can be spent. So, people give money to universities. They gave money to Columbia and they give money to Berkeley to support student financial aid. And we at Columbia certainly relied on that kind of income that we got from our endowment to establish what effectively was a discount rate for students of close to 50%. That is to say, for every dollar we charged in tuition, we actually only collected half that because the rest was made up of income off the endowment. So, there's that. But, people have given gifts to support particular kinds of programs about which they've, been deeply concerned. There are programs I started in South Asian studies. There were people who would give money specifically for supporting, a seminar in the study of India or in the study of, Armenian history or whatever it might be. And those monies can only be used for those purposes. And furthermore, you can only use the income from the endowment. So the endowment is meant to be in perpetuity. So it's money that is given to the university, which they cannot spend the principal of and can only spend the income. So it grows. And in fact, it's supposed to grow because, of course, there's inflation. And there's also, years when the income from investments is lower than others. So you have to average it over time. So you can come up with effectively what is a spend rate of around 5% of the total endowment, which is, effectively how universities have been planning on the way they use the endowment money. Now you can look through the endowment and you can see, what you might think are things that have been put aside for programs you don't care about. But those were the terms under which people gave money. And that's what I mean when I say the endowment is restricted.
Yeah.
So, university can have a lot of money and they can't spend it for purposes that
right.
are outside of the contract. So, there was a time when Yale had quite a bit of money in their endowment, but they also had these old buildings and all the roofs were beginning to fall apart. And there were, major leakage and damage, and dining halls in some of the old colleges, in New Haven, and there was no money to use to fix the roof. So, the appearance of the endowments obviously is something that is at odds with how people generally understand how they're used. That being said, Harvard, Princeton, Stanford have enormous endowments. And, one of the things that I did at Berkeley was to try to build an endowment there because we had so much less money that was available for some of the kinds of purposes that we really needed, especially since we were competing with Harvard and MIT and, the other great private universities that had so much more money. So we were trying to raise money and we're trying to build our endowments. And we look at those big endowments and say, well, how long is it going to take us to catch up? And feel frustrated by that. But it's not quite the way it seems.
Now, there's another critique. There are plenty of critiques of higher ed, but one other one focuses on administrative bloat, inefficiency. You hear this not just from outside, but from inside the academy. Professors talk about this all the time, I know. Let me give you an example. On data that I was able to find on UC Berkeley, it looks like to me that UC Berkeley has more managers on the payroll than full-time faculty. And I'm just wondering, what do you see as driving this, if you don't want to call it administrative bloat, growth of administration, if you will? And do you think that critics who say, well, there's just universities are too top-heavy, do they have a point?
So let me just begin by the general kind of question and problem, which was also part of your question about endowments, and that is really related to the cost of higher education. The cost of college has clearly gone up and up and up and up. It's gone up not just in the privates, it's gone up in the publics. And even at a place like Berkeley, where, for a long time, it really didn't cost very much to go to college. In fact, the governor, when I was chancellor, Jerry Brown, said repeatedly to me, he said, when I went to college, I only paid $70 a semester. Of course, I said to Governor Brown in reply that those were days when the state actually paid 70% of our budget. Yeah. And now they're only contributing about 12% of the overall budget. So I said, if you give us more money, we'll lower the rate of tuition. But even so, and you know, of course, that the two sectors that have seen the greatest increases in cost in the U.S. are education, higher education, and healthcare. Even so, the upward pressures on cost and the issues that is raised for accessibility and the kinds of real concerns it's raised for students who take vast amounts of loans and debt and then can't pay it back has been part of what has really created, I think, this growing disaffection with the university. This idea that they have all this money on the one side, but they basically are gouging tuition and charging usurious rates for what they offer, and then saddling people for years with crippling debt. So, there really are a lot of issues here. And the question about administrative bloat, and I'll use the word too, is a question that goes along with that. How many administrators do you need to keep a university going and keep the lights on and change the bulbs and the like? There has been enormous growth in administrative ranks. Now, there are, for the most part, good reasons for that. For example, at Berkeley, a lot of the so-called managerial administration actually work directly with students. At Berkeley, there are 40,000 students and fewer than 2,000 tenure and tenure track faculty. So, the faculty don't serve as advisors for students. They don't offer mental health services for students. They don't do a lot of the things that students need. And when you have those kinds of numbers, they need really in ways that drive your hiring up significantly. And by the same token, even faculty. I mean, if you go to a department like one of the ones that I was in at Berkeley, the history department, I mean, there are a number of administrators in the department who are serving faculty interests and helping them get reimbursement for expenses and helping them, do all kinds of things that are part of their work in the university. So it's not as if the administration is just serving administrative ends. They're actually supporting students. They're supporting faculty. They work with alumni. And in the case of a public university, they also work with the state government because that's an important part of the public set of relationships that a university has, and you have to be able to engage that public seriously. And of course, there are also people out there trying to raise money, and that becomes a growing group as well in the so-called advancement or development kinds of fields. In addition to that, universities, of course, are major centers of research, and especially in many science and engineering fields, that research goes along with federal funding that has very strict guidelines around compliance. And research administration has been a growing area of administrative hiring, and it's actually critical for bringing in huge resources from the federal government to support research that's being done on things that have been transformational in American life at the level both of what we're seeing now in terms of computation, artificial intelligence, at the level of healthcare, new discoveries around drugs and around treatments for diseases that we all suffer from or know someone who suffers from and want desperately to see cures for. So, there's a great deal that you can say is just, part of running a major university that both has lots of students, undergraduates and graduate students, and lots of research activity. Okay, but now you sent me some numbers that came out of the University of California, and one thing I would say is that in the University of California, you have 9 campuses that serve undergraduates. You have 10 campuses that are part of the university system that includes the University of California in San Francisco, which is largely a medical school and doesn't teach undergraduates. But you also in Oakland have the Office of the President that has a kind of parallel bureaucracy for running the system as a whole. And you, I think, could argue, and some of the numbers that you sent me, I think, could be used really in the service of this argument, that you don't need as many people off campus as they have, and that there's a lot of duplication. And there have been efforts over the years to really look seriously at that office and cut down the numbers and the costs associated with it. And I think, I think it actually is incumbent on all university administrators to really, really think hard about every administrator who is brought in. Are they really serving the overall purpose of the university, or do they just become, as it were, additional helpmates for other administrators who are creating work that isn't fundamental or absolutely necessary? But that would be part of a larger effort, I think, to identify and control costs and really take seriously the concerns of students, parents, and the American public at large, that we need to do far more to control the cost of higher education.
Now, there are a lot of people on the right who feel that universities, particularly public universities, shouldn't be taking positions on controversial political, social issues, taking sides in the culture wars, if you will. For example, after the Dobbs decision, University of California President Michael Drake issued a statement in which he said, for nearly 50 years, people in the United States have had the right to make private, informed choices about their health care and their futures. I am gravely concerned that today's U.S. Supreme Court decision removes that right and will endanger lives across the country. This decision overturns decades of legal precedent and could pave the way for other fundamental rights to be removed. It's a fairly strong statement, and just one that's just an example of many taken from the system in which you worked. What do you think about the university? Do you feel that's taking sides in the culture wars, and do you feel that's appropriate for especially public universities to do? Yeah,
good question. Well, this has been a hot button issue, obviously, of late, around, in particular, the events that happened on October 7th, and then the Israeli invasion of Gaza, and the kind of issues around, what kinds of statements university presidents and leaders should make. Many donors have criticized them for not making statements that have moral clarity, although, of course, one person's moral clarity is not necessarily the same as somebody else's.
Yeah.
But you're right to point to this as an issue that I think affects both public and private universities and is not really sufficiently resolved at this point. There have been some people who have been calling for complete neutrality. And in fact, the call for neutrality goes back, or institutional neutrality, I should say, The call for neutrality goes back in some ways to the Calvin report that was made to the University of Chicago back in 1967. Now, at that particular moment in history, and I've been in the 60s before in our conversation today, but at that particular moment in history, the effort was to, in some sense, protect the university from having to comment about things like the war in Vietnam. And so it was an extreme recommendation for institutional neutrality. And the argument behind it was that it was, if administrators speak, it might have a chilling effect on others within the university and discourage people from expressing their own points of view, as well as, simply being inappropriate, since universities are places where people develop and express their views, but of different kinds. And so if the university has one view, it's going to, in some sense, create a kind of orthodoxy, at least against which people would be reacting, if not feeling chilled with respect to. So, there was a lot to recommend this recommendation made by the Calvin report. But it turns out it's a little more difficult in practice. And so, in many cases, administrators have articulated the values of the university that include not only free inquiry, but things like, a welcoming, inclusive environment for students from different kinds of backgrounds. And these have been consistent with, the basic principles of the university, which is to bring as many people in as possible to provide them with the opportunities of higher education. And yet, even a statement about, say, inclusivity maps onto certain kinds of political positions in our current political moment, right? So that it is not necessarily consistent with being fully neutral. So then the question becomes where you draw the line. Now, I strongly believe that it was not something I should do to articulate, say, for example, a foreign policy on the part of a university. And that, my basic commitment was to, for example, work with universities in different parts of the world, work with academics in different parts of the world, work with scientists in different parts of the world, regardless of the politics around it. And, and for that reason, in fact, I was opposed to boycotting academics and universities from any place, whether one had major differences of opinion or not, because it was precisely to keep those kinds of channels of communication and interaction and engagement open that the university, in some sense, was made for. But, I guess you could argue that President Drake, when he made that statement, is talking about questions of health. And we've seen that the Supreme Court decision around abortion has actually led to major issues around the health care of individuals who are not being served when they are in certain kinds of medical conditions and situations that become impossible to address under the conditions of the Supreme Court judgment. But you're right; it's a strong statement, and I certainly accept his view that this is a major problem and issue. While at the same time, I concede the premise of your question, which is that, there's a kind of slippery slope. If you make too many kinds of statements that seem to map onto the culture wars, you're then, giving fuel to the critique that, these universities are basically, left-wing institutions that don't tolerate conservative views. So again, I'm not giving you a straight up yes, no answer. I apologize for that. But I am saying that I think that there have to be serious conversations among university administrators about the limits of what we say in order not to chill debate, but yet that nevertheless adhere to some fundamental values and principles that we can agree are in fact fundamental to the success of the university.
Well, I could easily and happily talk with you for at least another hour, but I know we have reached the end of our time. And so we will stop here. And just want to say, Professor Dirk, thank you so much for taking the time to talk with me today.
Thank you so much, Mike, for your interest in talking with me. I've enjoyed the conversation.
Thanks for listening to this Politics Guys interview. If you're not already a supporter of the show, I hope you'll consider becoming one, because without our supporters, we wouldn't be able to do this. And when you become a supporter, you get not just that warm, fuzzy feeling, knowing that you're supporting a good cause. I like to think we're a good cause, but you also get stuff like ad-free versions of everything we put out. You get our supporter exclusive midweek show, the full length of that, not just the preview. And you also get to be part of our Discord group if you want. And there's always some interesting conversations going on there. At the $10 a month level or more, you get to actually be part of the episodes Jay and I do, if that's something you're interested in. So there's a lot of stuff is what I am saying. And I hope you'll consider checking it out. And to do that, just go to patreon.com/politicsguys. If you want to support us on Venmo, we're at Politics Guys. You can also support the show through PayPal. And all of our support links are always in the show notes, as well as at politicsguys.com/support. And as always, I want to close with a very special thank you to our wonderful executive producers, Bruce Johnson, Wilma Moreno, Daniel Toe, Ryan Beasley, and Don Oglesby.
This podcast is part of the Democracy Group,